Dealing with people with substance abuse. Hey there.
Hello, Leanne.
How are you?
I'm very good, thank
It
you.
looks like you have a new hairstyle.
No, it's not a new hairstyle. It's hair pulled back due to the absence of hairstylists and barbers in the city of Toronto.
Well, the good news is it sounds like it may be happening. You may have access to one sooner than expected. So
that presupposes that I now want a haircut. I think I have now made the decision to show them up and show them that I will never use a hairstylist again. That was said sarcastically and to the dismay of my wife, by the way.
Well, her hair always looks really good. So whatever she's doing with or without hairstylists, it looks good.
It is. So, are we good to go?
We are good to go.
Why don't you kick it off?
Sure. So as I was mentioning to listeners, today's topic is what to do in situations if you have a partner who has a substance abuse problem. And, you know, by substance abuse, we mean the problem with drugs or alcohol. And, you know, sadly, this comes up in a lot of situations. I've certainly had a lot of cases where this has been an issue to varying degrees. And it's something that's, you know, sometimes it can even be a reason for the separation or divorce in the first place. So, you know, on this issue, I guess, Steve, first of all, have you encountered this a lot in your practice?
Yes. And first of all, for those viewers that are listening in, this is one of those topics where we would much prefer to use questions from you than for us to share with you some of the war stories and sad stories that we as lawyers have confronted. So feel free to share with us either a situation or a question. But the answer to your question, Leanne, is yes. And the reason the answer is yes is because if you actually go 10,000 feet in the sky and you were to survey 1,000 people who split up, and you were to find out why did they split up? Did they split up because of what the pop culture and the film industry have called irreconcilable differences, and whatever those words mean anyway? Or are there real reasons for why people split up? Well, I can tell you, one of the more popular, and I use that word very regrettably, one of the more popular reasons for why people split up is because of mental health problems. And some of those mental health problems result in behavior that's destructive. And in some cases, addictive behavior is destructive to the person. And if it's destructive to the person, it's destructive to the relationship. And that does end marriages. So that was a long way to say yes.
Yes. And, you know, and it's particularly sad when, you know, it's a family that has children, because, you know, regrettably then it raises issues, you know, surrounding the safety and well-being of the children when they're in the presence of a parent who has a substance abuse problem. And, you know, when we're referring to that, we're not describing people who, you know, occasionally, you know, on a Friday night, you know, have a few drinks, or, you know, even, you know, nowadays here in Canada, you know, the use of weed, for example, or marijuana is legal. So, you know, people who relax in the evening, you know, that way, we're not talking about a situation like that. We're talking about, you know, where it's a problem and it's actually interfering with someone's life or their ability to be a good parent or to be a responsible parent. I do see we have a question there.
I got the question and I will answer it, but you go ahead. I got the question and we're definitely going to answer it, but let's finish your thought, Leanne.
Yeah, so I mean, so we're dealing, you know, where it is a problem, and unfortunately, you get into situations where, you know, a parent who very much loves their children and wants to spend time with them, but they're not, you know, the other parent has to make the tough decision of, you know, somebody's calling me on something. I'm just trying to get rid of it. So
no, you froze for a second, but
yeah,
no, I have the message, and so let's back up a second and say that addictions, whether it's addiction to alcohol called alcoholism, whether it's an addiction to a illicit illegal drug like roofies or cocaine, whether it's an addiction to cannabis, which otherwise is legal to consume, but it's problematic if it's done to excess and without any social restraint or regulation. Or there's an addiction to gambling, or there's an addiction to sex or potentially dangerous sex with unknown people. All of these forms of addictive behavior really have a source. The source itself, and by the way, I'm not speaking now as a mental health professional, strictly as a lawyer who has worked with these people, with mental health professionals. The source is generally a psychological or psychiatric problem that then has its manifestation in addictive behavior. In some cases, it's volitional behavior. And in some cases, it's beyond the control and the willfulness of the person. And that is precisely why that addictions are recognized as a disability, and should, for example, an employer mistreat somebody who suffers from addictions, there could be a human rights complaint, because someone who suffers from addiction may very well be suffering from an addiction as a result of some other mental health problem, which is endemic to their person. And so we have to be ultra sensitive when dealing with this subject matter in the context of separation and divorce, because we, at this juncture, we can make platitudes and make generalizations, but is the behavior that is complained of volitional, or is it really a psychological or psychiatric problem that requires treatment, as opposed to pathologizing and penalizing the person?
But I think at the end of the day, the bottom line is if children are not safe, or if they're in danger, or they're, are going to be neglected, it doesn't matter if the behavior is volitional or if it's because of a, addiction that is a mental health issue. The impact is still the same. And so at the end of the day, as lawyers, and as, if you're a parent of a child who, and your spouse is struggling with addiction, you have to put the child first. And it doesn't matter, as I say, whether the person is voluntarily using these substances or drinking too much, whether they have some level of control over it or not. Hopefully if it's voluntary, then, if they think it's going to, impact their parenting time and their ability to be with their child, then they can stop doing it. But, obviously if it's an addiction issue and a real mental health issue, then it's not as simple as them, wanting to spend time with their children and then saying, okay, I will stop. Usually someone in that type of situation has the problem because they need help. Whether it's by way of, treatment, Alcoholics Anonymous, therapy, whatever it is that might work for that person. But usually people who have an actual addiction that they're not able to, that's interfering with their life, whether it's their children, their family, their job. If your drinking or your use of drugs is interfering with those things, then you have a problem and you need to get help, because most people wouldn't undermine their relationship with their children or their spouse or their job if they could, by using alcohol or drugs, if they could stop using it. So, I say to people who are in that type of situation, like, this is a problem that's bigger than you, and you need to get help. And the sooner you get help, the better. It's something that very few people can get out of on their own. And again, I'm not a mental health professional, so I'm speaking, as a lawyer who's observed it and just have observed it with people that I know. It's something that, if it was as simple as somebody stopping doing it on their own, then they would have stopped already. So that if you're out there yourself and you're struggling, you do need to get help with this.
So let me let's now turn this, for the viewers' benefit, into tips and guidelines on how to deal with it. And as much as you, Leanne, have identified the real problem as it relates to the safety of children, and I believe that the role of this conversation, that is addictions in separation and divorce, is very much a hot topic when it comes to the subject matter of parenting and the safety of children in the care of the person who might otherwise suffer from an addiction. I don't want to skip over the cases whereby addiction is a problem where there is a relationship with no children. And so there's a role for family law counsel, advice, and planning where there's addictive behavior in non-child-based families. And so I've had over the years cases both where there's addiction with children, there's addiction without children in the family, and the advice that we give and the role that we play is very different. And so that takes me right into one of the questions that we just had by a viewer. And they said, well, you know, how do you prove that? Well, let's first go backwards and say, well, are we dealing with a person who has an addiction? And for the purposes of this conversation, let's just call it a drug addiction. In fact, let's even be more narrow and call it an addiction to cocaine. And so here we have a situation where there's an addiction to cocaine, or at least an alleged addiction to cocaine. And so, number one, we've got the person who is using cocaine placing themselves at risk. Number two, we have that person potentially putting their finances at risk. That's number two. Number three, we have a situation where the occupants of the home might be at risk because now who knows who is coming to the house to buy or sell the illegal drug that might be putting other occupants who may or may not be children at risk, like the spouse or other occupants of the home. Maybe the parents live with them. Maybe there are other tenants living in that property. And then, of course, we've got the other spouse who is at risk. So, and then in some cases, we have, of course, the children as well. So we've got a lot of levels of risk. And so there will not be one answer that addresses all of the risks across the board. I can tell you this much. If there is an addiction issue and there are children, the children might otherwise be at risk. And one of the smartest tools to address the risk is by reporting this to the Children's Aid Society, whose mandate is to ensure that the children are not in a position of risk. And if that is a determination made by a CAS, by a Children's Aid Society, it takes the pressure off of the spouse, and it actually lets another agency, free of charge, identify it, determine it, and then provide solutions for it without it necessarily becoming criminal. And so I wanted to throw that out as a tool where there are children involved. But what if there's no children involved? Does that mean there's no solution through CAS? Well, I can tell you this much. CAS won't get involved if there's no children in the home. Or quite frankly, if the other parent is not living in the home but wants the children to be in their care in another location, CAS will still be involved. But what about a situation where there's no children at all? Does that mean that the person doesn't have any solutions or doesn't have any remedies? And the answer is no, not necessarily, because in a situation like that, it could be a criminal investigation that might be involved. It might be financial relief that needs to be implemented in order to protect the family pocketbook before it is exhausted or depleted. And quite frankly, the very subject of addiction, most of the time, I don't think I've actually, if I think about it now, I don't think I've ever had a case that involves addictions where the person that is alleged to have the addiction comes forward and admits, I have an addiction. Yeah. I did have a case a couple of years ago where the person said, I did have an addiction. I sought therapy. I went into rehab and I'm better now and I'm clean now. And I've been, 3 years and 5 days and 4 hours clean. That I've had. But where we've had a case where I represent the addicted person or I represent the spouse of the addicted person, I've never had in that case where it's live, where it's occurring, the person admitting, yes, I have an addiction, because quite frankly, it effectively forecloses their rights. And I'm not saying that admitting to it is the wrong thing or the right thing. I'm not making an opinion on that, but the general reaction is to deny it. And I can't explain it because I can't understand the psychology behind it because I don't have that sort of training, but there is a tendency to deny it. And when it's denied, back to our viewer who asked the question, how do you prove it? And so I'm going to turn that over to you, Leanne. Let me hear from you what sort of ideas you have about how to prove it where the other person denies it. And I'm going to join you afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, well, that is an issue. Proving it can be a challenge for people, especially if you're in a high conflict situation, which often you are when there's an addiction being, alleged by one of the parties and a denial by the other. So, you're then feeling like you're in a situation where it's what I would call a he said, she said, and you want to try and harness independent evidence aside from, you just saying it, because that's, the other party is going to say, well, that's not true, and she hates me or he hates me, and it won't be given the same weight. So some of the things that can be done, I mean, one thing that's always helps with that type of argument is if there has been criminal charges laid. For example, if a person has a history of drug arrests or DUIs, or which we don't call them that in Canada, we call them impaired driving or driving with over 80 milligrams of alcohol in your blood. If somebody has convictions or has been charged with those types of offenses, then that is going to help you in your argument that this person does have a substance abuse problem. Other things you could do, is you could always take photographs. If there's things, if there's drugs in the home, you could take photographs of them. I'm not a big fan of, videotaping people, but sometimes it is important to protect yourself. So I've seen situations where clients had a spouse who was, passed out from alcohol. And so with a bunch of beer cans beside them, and, they've taken a video evidence of that. I've had clients where they hired a private investigator to follow their spouse around and actually got photographs, or they got footage of him scoring drugs from his dealer and then actually sitting in his car and snorting a substance that, very much resembled cocaine. Now, obviously, without testing the drug, no one can prove definitively that it's cocaine, but it looks pretty suspicious, when you have that type of material. And, some of this type of stuff too, you don't necessarily have to use it in court. Sometimes the party who is, using the substances, when they see photographs of themselves like that, they'll realize they've got a problem here and they don't want that to go into a court. So then they might be more agreeable to getting treatment or to doing something, to keep it out of court.
So you've identified some really good ideas. So let's recap a couple of them and then I'll add a few more. So where children are involved, you can call the Children's Aid Society that services your community and your particular category of service, whether you're Native, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Catholic, whether you're none of the above. There are Children's Aid Societies operating throughout the province, and their job is to ensure that children are safe. And if there's addiction issues in the home, or even not in the home, but pertaining to the children, places them at risk, then a call to them would be your most immediate solution to ensure the safety of the children. And in fact, there have even been cases that I've been involved in the past where my own client, who is not the one addicted, has split up from somebody with an addiction and allows the children to go and visit them. And Children's Aid Society has gotten involved and said to my client, if you allow the children to go and visit the other parent who is known to be suffering from a drug addiction, we are going to come in and apprehend the children and not leave them with you. So the CAS's job is not to service one or both parents, it's to ensure the safety of the children. And addictions, in most cases, serve as a threat to the safety of children. Now, back to some of the other ideas that you had, Leanne. Photographs, surveillance. I'm going to add a couple more to that. Whether it's alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, or quite frankly, prescription medications that can be obtained legally, but then used excessively, like Oxy or others, oftentimes there is some form of evidence. So for example, in the case of alcohol, getting the bank records and the MasterCard and Visa records to show the extent of purchases of alcohol at the liquor store. For the purposes of cannabis, the number of visits to a cannabis store, oftentimes shown on Interact statements, bank statements, and credit card statements. That would give a judge an opportunity to see the frequency of such purchases. For the person to say, well, I smoke a joint once a month, but they've got, $2,800 of purchases at the cannabis store in the last 90 days may not necessarily match the theory of the case of the person claiming that they do not have an addiction. And a judge might very well be looking for circumstantial evidence to support the theory of the person making the allegation. Another one is independent evidence. So, for example, visual observations by others. So, for example, if the addicted parent comes to your door and your brother, your friend, your cousin is at the door also and can observe the person behaving in an odd, erratic, or sketchy way, that other person might swear an affidavit indicating what they saw. And in some cases, these days, people have video at their front door, and that is not a means of privacy invasion. You are allowed to have a video perched up on your front door. In fact, most doorbell companies these days have that as part of their service offering, and that video footage may very well be a compellable and valuable evidence.
Even just going back to the financial records, another one, aside from like the credit card statements and whatnot, is if somebody's doing a lot of large cash withdrawals. You know, I've seen, again, where I've had a client with a cocaine problem, and, you know, large, you know, everyday large cash withdrawals, you know, was consistent with what was being said about his cocaine use.
And in fact, most of the withdrawals, and I had a case like this where the transit number of the location of the withdrawals happened to be very close to a known location for the purposes of the sale of cocaine. And so by building a case and by showing the court the totality of the evidence of what people have observed, including the other parent, the withdrawal of money, the location of the withdrawal of money, the lack of an explanation of that amount and that frequency of withdrawal at that particular Interact machine, all of that together may support the theory of the case, when on one hand, it's not perfectly provable, but on the other hand, we're dealing with a 2, 4, and 6-year-old child, and a judge may very well be, you know what, I don't know what to believe, but it's premature. And it may be that the relief sought is, and this is, by the way, where lawyers come in, it's really important. When I represent somebody where the spouse, my client, is alleging an addiction on the other side for the purposes of securing either no access or supervised access, I will actually present it in such a way to the judge that we actually don't know conclusively, but we do have serious concerns. And the solution, and this is where judges really prefer this, they prefer a solution. So here's an example of a solution. We don't know exactly, but in the meantime, that is the parent of the children. The children should see their mother or their father. But we do have a service in Ontario to provide supervised access. The supervised access could be either by another family member. The supervised access can be in a closed place, although these days it's very difficult because of COVID. The supervisor could be an independent supervisor, and there are a number in Toronto that provide supervision services. And we are not asking, this is my argument now, we are not asking for this to be perpetual. We're asking that this occur for the next 8 weeks. And over the next 8 weeks, we would like the person to be subjected to random blood tests, or random saliva tests, or random hair follicle tests to ascertain. The follicle test, the hair follicle test, tends to be able to provide information that goes back 90 days. And so this is a situation where the judge would say, you know what, how intrusive is this? 1, 2, 3 follicle tests come back in 2 months. Maybe that will put this to rest, because if the person who is alleged to be addicted to cocaine has no such evidence to make that conclusion, then it may very well be that we were overzealous in advocacy, and we cannot back that up with proof. It may be that the person herself or himself was paranoid. We don't know, but at least it gives the judge the out to ensure a balancing of safety with evidence.
Now, I'm curious, Steve, because I've had situations where, again, like I think drug testing is always with supervised access is always a great solution in these types of cases. And if, you know, your client is the one alleging the drug use, it's a great avenue to go. And it kind of makes the other party look, if they refuse to do it, it can make them look like, well, why are you, if you don't have a problem, why are you refusing? But if you were to turn it around and the client that you have is the one, that where it's being alleged there's a cocaine problem or, substance abuse problem, would you, in that situation, but your client's denying it, but you're kind of, based on what you've seen and, heard, you're kind of suspicious that maybe, because that's the other problem, clients who are abusing drugs often don't admit it to their lawyer either because they are in denial. Would you advise someone in that type of situation to take a drug test?
Yeah. So make no
try
mistake.
To stop that?
When I've represented both those accused of addiction, those accusing people of addiction, and those that actually have an addiction, and those are three different categories. And in a situation like that, let me talk about what happens when I represent the person that they told me that they are regularly using cocaine or oxy or something else. My first goal is for my client to have good health. My second goal is for my client to be on the road to recovery and long-term sustainable good health. My third goal is to address their family law issues, and usually that means to ensure that they have an amicable divorce and a healthy relationship with their children. And so I approach it in that order, and there's more down the list of objectives. But on that subject, I will connect them with the right mental health supports in order to begin the process. It has two byproducts. Byproduct number one, they are going to get healthy. Byproduct number two is we are now building the narrative. We are now addressing the PR problem that my client has about them having an addiction. By the way, in cases like that, I will work tooth and nail to not allow this to become public. I will work hard to not allow this to become part of the court record. And I will try my best to communicate either with the other spouse or their lawyer that we are on the path to an improvement. And if I gain their cooperation, they will have an ex-spouse who is working together as opposed to against, right, ensuring the safety of children. But if we make this a public war, this will not go well for everybody. And so I encourage the other side to work with me as opposed to against me and ensure that we are going down the right path. And if we install the right people from the get-go, we achieve that. Sorry, Leanne.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, and it's often in the interest of the other party to keep it private as well, because if you have children with somebody, or if you're looking for spousal support or child support, it's not in your interest to have it made public or be part of the public record that your spouse has a substance abuse problem. It could affect their employment opportunities. It could affect, if somebody got wind of it that knows your children or your family, it could hurt your children in some way. And so I think that's, something where people
some people have a short-term goal. Some people are so upset over their separation and divorce. Some people will see, and quite frankly, for good reason, that the other person's behavior is an injury on them, is an act against them. And their reaction is, I want to call it out. I want the world to know, and I want the person to suffer for what they made me suffer. So I'm not suggesting that I agree with that approach or disagree with it, but it's a normal human reaction to what occurs when you realize you're in a relationship with someone that has not only damaged themselves, but is damaging the relationship and potentially putting the children at risk. But that goal, the goal of outing it, of publicizing it, of embarrassing the other person, has a short-term remedy. But really what people want, and this is where we as lawyers come in, we educate them about the long-term consequences and the long-term opportunities that exist. And quite frankly, the best work that we as lawyers do is not only to solve the problem today, but prevent the problem from occurring in the future and to ensure a future where when they arrive at their child's wedding or high school or university graduation, they could sit together and not necessarily look at each other with fire in their eyes, 10, 20, 30 years later. And if you do the wrong thing when the family is breaking up due to an addiction, you could actually be laying the foundation for a lifetime of hatred, anger, and acrimony. And that is not good for anybody.
No, very true. And maybe on that note, that's a great way to end this segment. But I think that there's a lot to be said. And I know we did have a lot of comments in our comments section. And just maybe before we wrap up, I know there was one person who mentioned they brought a motion themselves because their spouse or their ex-spouse had a new partner who it was alleged was abusing drugs. And so, you know, that's where it can extend. It's not just the two parents, but if there's going to be other people living in the home who have a substance abuse issue, that can affect things as well in terms of parenting time and whatnot. So I guess kudos to the viewer who dealt with that issue successfully.
And let me say this before we conclude. For those that listen to this subject matter, it's a very sensitive topic. It evokes a lot of different reactions and feelings. And to the extent that either myself or Leanne may have said something that may have disturbed you or upset you, please accept our apologies. We simply are sharing information from our professional experience. And I underline the fact, 2 points. One, we are not mental health professionals. We are legal professionals. And two, if the subject matter is something that you are dealing with, I urge you to get proper independent legal advice from someone that can understand your personal situation and give you very specific advice for your case.
No, exactly. Well, thank you, Steve. As always, I think that this was fun, and we've, I think, provided some helpful information today. Thank you, viewers, for joining in, and we'll see you here next week.
You got it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.